Olá, pessoal. Tudo bem? And welcome to the Brazil Crypto Report podcast, where we talk to the builders, entrepreneurs, and influencers from across the Brazil crypto ecosystem. I'm your host, Aaron Stanley, and today we're kicking off season 2 of the podcast and launching a new video format for YouTube. I'm joined today by two very special guests. We have Karen Duque, who is the head of policy at Bitso Brasil, and also Julian Dutra, who is the head of government relations at Mercado Bitcoin. Both Julian and Karen spearheaded the effort to pass legislation in December of last year that will establish a regulatory framework for cryptocurrency businesses operating in Brazil. This legislation was 7 years in the making, so getting this over the finish line and signed into law, given the current market conditions, was a massive win for the industry, both in Brazil and globally. So we are going to dive into this new law, what it aims to accomplish, what the next steps are with regards to implementation. And we're also going to get some color on how this all came together behind the scenes. Julian and Karen, thank you so much for being here. Seja muito bem-vindo. But let's do some quick introductions. Karen, why don't you give us a bit of background on who you are and how you came to work in public policy at Brazil, right? Bitso Brasil. And thanks so much for joining us, both of you.
No, thank you for hosting me and providing us at Bitso the opportunity to discuss such an important subject matter for us, which is regulation. So a little bit of background on myself. I've been with Bitso for 8 months. I joined the 1st of June last year, but I've been actually working with policy for 12 years. Actually got to meet Julian in my first job here in Brasilia. We can tell the story later on. But I've been living in Brasilia and working with policy since 2012, and with technology for a little bit of half of that. Started my gigs in technology working for a ride-hailing company called Didi Xuxin. That was actually, by the time, a Brazilian startup that was acquired by Didi later on, which is an Uber competitor. So I worked really intensely on the ride-hailing debate here in Brazil, approving federal law that actually regulated those types of services. Then I joined Google. I stayed with them for 3 years, debating internet regulation. And because I do believe that Web3 is the future of internet, I decided to join Bitso and start that gig on this Web3 role, which is actually super excited. So thank you for hosting us here and providing the opportunity to debate that.
Awesome. And Julian, over to you. And I want to hear the story also about how you both were sort of frenemies in a previous job, sort of a previous political battle. So, but Julian, over to you.
Yeah, Aaron, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Karen. Karen is a great friend. I think both of us are addicted to democracy because democracy is the path to build good and balanced public policies. I've been working for government affairs for 21 years, and I started in some consultancy companies helping the private sector to deal with the government. And after that, I worked for telecom, for tobacco industry, where I know, and I started to work with Karen. That's a great story for both of us. And after that, I joined a technology company, data technology company. Actually, it's a credit bureau company, the Serasa Experian. And after that, I got so much passion for technology, and it's difficult to think other sector than technology to the capacity of changing people's lives. So I've been working for Mercado Bitcoin now for 1 year and 1 month, the 2TM group, and was a pleasure to work to establish a balanced legal framework for the crypto in Brazil, and it's just about to start. That's the truth.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So let's start by discussing this new law and what it actually entails. Do you want to start, Karen, by giving us a bit of an overview of just what this law is, from a high level, what it aims to accomplish, and then we'll kick it over to Julian for some extra color as well.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think that there are a few highlights of the law that are important for us to have in mind. Probably the first one is the definition of what is crypto. I mean, taxonomy is important when we talk about law. So we do define what this is going to mean when it comes to the internal regulatory framework, and while defining it, we actually followed international discussions and good trends that we have internationally when it comes to building taxonomy of crypto. It is a fairly broad definition, which is not bad in the end, because it's something, that we're still trying to understand as society. So if you have a really well-structured, close definition of things, you might, in the end, struggle technology, and that's something that the Brazilian law didn't do. The second important point for me is that the law recognized the legitimacy of crypto business, which is important to provide the state stamp on something that you can do. Even though it was not prohibited in the past, it is important to provide state level stamp and give society the assurance that investing in crypto is actually legal. So legal certainty for crypto business, and also for clients, for investors, for companies, for the ecosystem in general, it's something that the law provides, and that's really important for the business side of things. It establishes also an authorization process for exchanges to operate in Brazil. And that's actually super important, because in the end, you have the regulator, which we don't know who is going to be yet, even though the market has an expectation of being the central bank. So you give the regulator the ability to actually approve or not exchanges to be able to operate in Brazil. And that's going to come through secondary regulation. We will establish how this registration process will work. But that's important because in the end, you have a point of contact to which you can debate the practices in the market if you are a regulator. And that's something really important to actually provide transparency for users as well. Then I guess one of the other important points for me are the guidelines. So the law provides and establishes general guidelines for the exchanges to operate. And we're talking about guidelines on governance, risk-based approach, data protection, safety, consumer protection, anti-money laundering practices, and so on and so forth. And those guidelines will serve as a line for the regulator, which again, we do expect to be the central bank, to actually provide more details on how these practices are going to be needed to be applicable in the market. So I always give the authorization process as a tangible example for people to understand. So we know that exchanges will need to register. We don't know how this is going to happen. And the central bank will let us know how this is going to happen. And the same thing will happen for money laundering, anti-money laundering practices, data protection, safety, and so on and so forth. And last but not least, it creates penalty for those who commit fraud using crypto. It's an interesting way to actually say that we are going to be restrictive when it comes to bad practices in that market. And that's important for us, not because it wasn't a crime before, because it was already a crime, but since it is a market that historically is connected to unjustly connected to bad practices, it is important for us to have a public narrative of actually punishing people who use that great system with great external positiveness to actually commit crimes.
Got it. Thank you for that overview.
If Julian wants to compliment me on something I probably forgot. I mean, it's a very complex process.
Yeah, Julian. So anything you want to add to that, or compliment or highlight?
What I see here is so much passion from Karen to explain the law. So it's full of a completely explanation. So I just wanted to put some color here in terms of understanding the economic scenario for crypto globally. When you see crypto as an alternative for the people, as alternative products of financial or financing or investment, we have some external effects. I mean, the speculation. this is a great systemic risk for the ecosystem for crypto. So to combat and to struggle against some of these systemic risks, the legislators started to understand how to tackle it, and they imposed some of the rules to attack directly these systemic risks. I mean, money laundering and frauds. Here in Brazil, we have a very strong financial system. So taking into this as an example for the ecosystem, for crypto ecosystem, we can get some of the good examples to protect consumers, to protect investors. So what is the law at all? It's as a general framework, legal framework. And the main objective here is to protect investors and protect consumers. That's it.
Great. Thank you for that. Super helpful. Great context from both of you there. So let's kind of dive into some of the theater of like how this all came to be. So as I mentioned in the intro, crypto legislation in Brazil has been in the works since like 2015 for quite a long time. It wasn't until late 2021 when things really began to get serious, which is when the Chamber of Deputies passed an initial version of the legislation in December of that year. And then that set the stage for a pretty eventful 2022. And Julian, this is about when you came onto the scene in about January 2022 of last year. So I'd like for you to walk us through kind of what happened, kind of starting when you came on board with MB and 2TM. And what was in that initial chamber bill? What happened after it was kicked over to the Senate in early 2022? And how did that ultimately end up getting passed in the Senate?
Yeah, sure. When I joined MB, the 2TM group, I saw a great involvement of a central bank to pass the legislation in the end of the 2021. When they got strong involvement, we saw the bill passing very fast through the Chamber of Deputies, because there was no consensus of what kind of a bill needed to pass. But the legislators and the decision makers at all, they learned a lot how to discipline technology in Brazil. It's very important not to put the pen weight in there to build a public policy, as it has a very strong risk to impose some obstacles to technology to develop markets. So they understand that we need to work with principles and guidelines, like Karen said, and impose some measures to combat the systemic risks. So having this tax passed at the Chamber of the Deputies, the first thing that I noticed is to understand, because despite of the fact that we have both houses independent, we need to understand the scenario, the political scenario. What was the relationship between the houses in terms of this policy? And we understood that we need to respect the independency of the Senate, because the Senate had 3 bills for crypto to be evaluated at the Economic Committee there. So we decided to make some dialogues with the presidency of the Senate to put in hold the bill that passed at the Chamber of the Deputies, and hold and wait the independency of the Senate to evaluate the other bills that was in process there. So taking into account, they took the 3 bills and they decided to put in one draft and pass it at the Economic Committee. and they headed to the plenary to attach to the other bill from the Chamber of Deputies. So taking this situation, one of the things that I missed was, why not build a great coalition between the industry associations to put some force to push forward the bill and to create the necessary awareness for the senators to approve the bill as fast as they can. So they passed the legislation very fast on April, and had it be returned to the Chamber of the Deputies. So when it returned to the Chamber of the Deputies, we faced some of problems of political scenarios, like the elections and the other things that we discussed at that time. So, Karin, if you want to put some other comments here.
Great. So basically what happened in the Senate was that the Senate already had, there's these 3 separate bills that were being, had been crafted and that were being reviewed by different committees or this economic committee within the Senate. And then those were ultimately passed through the committee level, and they were attached to the legislation that passed the chamber in December of 2021. And then that's kind of, Karen, that's where you come in, right? Because you joined BITSO right around this time. So when you sort of you joined and you're sort of thrown right into the fire, I suppose, what was the scenario like when you what was your baptism by fire, I suppose, I guess, but what was the scenario on the ground like when you first joined?
Yeah, I had to democratically disagree with Julian when I joined. I'm kidding. So look, the overall, I mean, one thing that struggled me positively actually was that the overall, we're defending and making advocacy for companies. We have a tendency, and Julian, please correct me if you think I'm not correct, but we have a tendency of often do not be proactively wanting to approve a bill. Our tendency is also to try to reject them. So in this case, it was surprising for me that the perception of BITSO towards regulation was actually positive. Because in the end, we do believe that it's essential to be able to provide trust, to provide transparency to users, and few countries in the world have crypto regulation framework. And so this scenario kind of forces exchanges to proactively acquire licenses or to try to fit into structure that do not necessarily would fit for crypto companies. So in the end, we saw it as an opportunity to build a framework that would make sense for us that are already an end-to-end regulated operation, but under different jurisdictions, we have different licenses. So building that in Brazil was kind of perceived as an opportunity. So that was something that struggled me when I joined the company. We saw it in a positive manner. Of course, we saw a few points of improvement, and that's where me and Julian had to politely disagree in the beginning, but we got to a good point after a few months of debating it. The main point of tension for us, and that was something that I worked a lot when I joined BITSO, was the so-called transition rule, or like we call it internally because I think it's easier to understand, the 0 days rule, which created in the end a new obligation for companies to have a specific tax ID specifically related to crypto. And in our view, even though we have a tax ID in Brazil, BITSO does have that. Creating a new obligation for a company, it's something that needs to have time for companies to adjust for internal planning, fiscal matters, and so on and so forth. So what we were actually aiming in the end with that transitional rule was just to have time to adjust. And I mentioned that we agreed after a few months of discussion, because in the end, we understood that we agreed on the principle and on the motivation. It is important for companies to have tax IDs in Brazil for several reasons, for contact issues, for fiscal issues, for being able to debate with regulators, and so on and so forth. So we agreed on the principle and on the motivation, and we understood that after a few months of positive debate. The rapporteur actually removed that from the final draft which does not mean that companies will not need to have a tax ID in Brazil, because the regulator will probably require that in the registration process. So in the end, this is actually going to be a requirement. We'll just have time to adjust, which was something that we actually advocated a lot.
Can I double click on that really quick? So sure. It wasn't, as far as my understanding was, it wasn't the transition rule, or however we want to refer to it as, wasn't necessarily like whether exchanges operating in Brazil should or should not have a tax ID. It was more of like, when would they need to have that tax ID to begin operating in Brazil? Is that, am I understanding that correctly, or is there more nuance here that I'm missing?
Yes and no. So there is not a requirement for companies to have a tax ID in Brazil in the current law that we approved, but there is a requirement for companies to be authorized to operate, and we do assume that the central bank, being the regulator, it's going to necessarily require those companies to have a tax ID in order for them to register. So even though it's not written in the law, we do assume that this is going to be a secondary regulation provision that will come as a good practice for the market.
Got it. Julian, do you want to add anything on this transition rule? I know this was a bit of a hot topic back in the summer. Was there any other call you wanted to add on this?
Yeah. We politely disagree at that moment, but was completely necessary. We were living in a moment of the market was suffering a lot, and there was one point that we consider a systemic risk was the unfair competition. Some of the great players, they don't have a legal entity registered in Brazil. So that was one of the main concerns. And I explained to Karen a lot at that time, and she understood very well, because Bitso is legally registered in Brazil. So we tried to struggle against the unfair competition. So at that moment, we were on a rush, because we know that we were about to pass through a election period in Brazil. So we were in a rush. We tried to pass very fast, because we tried to avoid the election period, because after the election period, it would be a very, very difficult to approve. But we didn't lose our beliefs, right, Karen, to approve, and we believe it until the end of the match, and we tried to push it in the end of the year. So at that moment, we were in a rush, and we tried to pass very fast and to combat very strongly the unfair competition. That was we tried to push this transitional rule.
Well, one thing, Aaron, you gotta know about me and Julian is that we are two believers. We go up to the end.
Amazing. I can tell. You're definitely bleeding the true believer blood here. So nicely done. So going back here to June 2022 here, kind of going back in time. I remember I first got the news. I think I was at Consensus in Austin, the CoinDesk conference, when I heard the news that Expedito Neto, who was the deputy, who was the rapporteur for the bill in the House, basically. How would you translate rapporteur into English? Because like in the U.S. we don't really necessarily call it like a relator, or like a like kind of like a sponsor, like a main sponsor, or the person who's responsible for sort of shepherding the bill. We don't really have like a direct translation that we use in the U.S. I don't think, but basically this guy Expedito Neto, who was the main deputy responsible for this legislation. He took the legislation that came over from the Senate, and because the Senate had made these changes, they'd added in these changes from these committee bills that you had mentioned, Julian. The full text had to come back to the Chamber of Deputies to be voted on again. And when Expedito Neto saw some of these additions, so things like the transition rule, and also things like asset segregation, which we'll talk about, he took these out, which was, I think unexpected, and people were not happy about it, and it really sort of threw some sand in the gears, essentially. of this legislation moving through the House. Do we have any idea of like why he decided to take these out? Was this like, you know, a clever lobbying by your opponents, or was this him just being principled and not thinking this was a good idea, or what was going on here behind the scenes? Like why did these provisions get removed? Anybody who wants to take that?
Look, I guess there are a few things that we can highlight here. So he opposed to a few provisions of the Senate, not just the asset segregation one. He also opposed to the transition rule, to green mining, to other things that were added by the Senate. There is always a political struggle for power between houses. So, I mean, approving something that you actually believe you should do, it's something that rapporteurs from different houses tend to do politically. So there is a political fight, struggle between houses that was an important factor to be analyzed here. Every rapporteur has his individual assumptions or beliefs. He mentioned several times that he thought, and that's his view, and that's a public record that can be found in the videos of the sessions, that he believed that asset segregation could be bad for new products. He did believe that adding that right now could prevent innovation, could prevent products that we don't actually know that could exist in such an innovative market. And that's, I mean, his public justification about that. On the transitional rule, he also publicly mentioned that creating new obligations for companies that are currently operating in the market could prevent them to operate. On the green mining point, he mentioned that there was not public budget provision in order to make tax exemptions for these types of products. So he had a justification for each one of the points, but it's basically his beliefs, and that's part of politics, especially when you talk about innovation regulation or technology regulation. We're still building knowledge about it. We're still building knowledge about Web3, and the feeling that I have is that the rapporteur Expedito Neto tendency was to try to not over-regulate right now, but to create standards and see how the market will adjust to those standards. If we need to further regulate in the future, we can do it. But if we over-regulate now, we can get to a point where we actually crash the market.
Yeah, and on a principle basis, I think that makes sense, right? I think it's, you know, you don't want to, especially with an industry as sort of novel and dynamic as this, where you don't want to get into the business of just over-prescribing things and basically making this look like, you know, finance 2.0, and just it's the same financial system just built on top of, you know, kind of crypto rails or whatnot. It kind of removes all the interesting components out of crypto, basically. So I understand it from a principles basis, but I understand also that there's a massive sausage making process going on here as well. There's sort of, you know, the overseas exchanges such as like Binance and, I mean, FTX, they're not around anymore, but they were around. They were operating in Brazil. And also there's the TradFi banks and digital banks as well, which are much more active in Brazil as it relates to crypto than they are in places like the US, with regards to like actively, like, you know, they have brokerages and they're offering these products. So one of the points I wanted to just check in on really quick was, what was the role of sort of the, you know, the TradFi banks and maybe some of these digital banks like Nubank in the lobbying process here? Were they heavily involved here? Was this an issue that they had much skin in the game on, or was this maybe too small for them to worry about at that stage in the game? Julian, you want to take that one?
Yes, I can take it. I just wanted to say that I completely agree with Karin in terms of the political scenario around the process itself. We've been passing through a difficult moment in terms of legislature itself. There is a lack of understanding between the houses. So a lack of dialogue, a lack of consensus to pass legislations and avoid some of these obstacles that we've been passing through these years. So in terms of involvement of other players, the digital banks and Nubank and other players, what we saw a deep involvement of them in the around May or April or May of last year, when the bill passed and returned to the Chamber of Deputies. And we saw their involvement as a good thing, as a positive thing, because most of the players tried to understand more crypto ecosystem, and they started to create more businesses and agreements with other players from the crypto world. So when they got involvement on this, we started to monitor the market itself, and we saw all these agreements, all this new business being started by them. This is good. This is positive because it generates more business, more agreements naturally. So they started to work with ourselves here with the crypto, and they helped us very much to make some pressure and push this bill forward.
There was actually, Aaron, we managed to sign a joint letter of fintechs, crypto companies, and the National Federation of Banks, actually pushing for the approval of the bill. So it was a consensus among the financial traditional or non-traditional sector that we needed to approve a framework for crypto. And of course, the advancement of those new banks or technology banks, players such as Nubank or Mercado Libre in things like crypto, increase their need to monitor and to participate in that debate. As Julian mentioned, they came after us. So of course, we were involved since the beginning. They kind of joined the car while it was already moving, but they played a key role on supporting us via associations or jumping into the Ladder initiative, which had great coverage in press and helped us to create the momentum for the voting.
Got it. And then
sorry. There is a very, very interesting point here. Not the financial system or digital bank companies or crypto companies working together. We had the greatest association for technology companies here in Brazil, Brascom, that involved to push forward this bill, and they well understand how to help the government to build good public policy for technology, and their interest was only on technology itself. They said, if it is good for blockchain, it's a way to create alternatives and promote the democracy of access. We will support it. So that's a good point.
Great. And I think that's a huge point that really, I think, can't be overemphasized, is the extent that you all were able to create, this coalition of the willing, I suppose, of a diverse enough group of other reputable industries, other reputable sectors that maybe these deputies and these senators, they won't necessarily listen to a lobbyist from a crypto company, but they'll listen to lobbyists from these people, and if they're teamed up with the crypto industry, then that adds a lot more cachet. So I think that's very different than what you see sort of in the U.S. right now, where I think crypto is sort of is sort of getting laying on the curb, getting kicked repeatedly by everybody, right? It's so everybody's favorite whipping boy, I suppose. So I want to touch on that a little bit later as well. Come back to that, but I'd like to kind of finish. Let's kind of round out the year in the course of events here, how everything came together. I mean, I think, Julian, to your point about the election season coming up, there was, going back to last summer, there was an urgency to get these things, get this thing moving, get this thing passed before election season kicked in. Unfortunately, you were not able to do that, and the clock kind of ran out. kind of early August when the Cámara went into recess for, kind of went into campaign season. What was the feeling around that time? I know just in talking to people, there was a lot of folks I talked to who were very skeptical that this would pass at all in 2022. A lame duck sort of session seemed unlikely, or passing this in a lame duck session seemed really unlikely, just given other priorities. But what was, kind of around like last August when the time kind of ran out, the clock ran out. What was the sentiment? Were you still optimistic, or was it still, things are looking a bit difficult? Julian, you want to take that?
Yeah. When as we said to you previously, Karen and I, we are very optimistic in the essence, right? In the essence, we like to fight until the end of the final match. I think it's important not to lose our beliefs here, because on the democratic standards, we do understand we have sometimes to push forward some awareness from the legislators, that's a matter that's it's worthy, it's important for the whole economy. Let's accelerate it. Let's be on the vanguard of globally on the crypto ecosystem. And of course, there was one component, very, very strong component, was the FTX bankruptcy. Was very important at that time, and show the problem of asset segregation. So the whole discussions at that time was asset segregation. What's it, and then in how and why crypto ecosystem needs to adopt it. Of course, at that time, the rapporteur or Expedito Neto didn't want to get into the draft, but was a very important discussion around our system. That's a very nice and important benchmark for the traditional financial system that we needed to put on our draft bill, because it's a good example. It's a way to protect consumers and investors. And we decided to unify all the industry associations around it, and we got 7 industry associations. I think so. 7 industry associations, including the traditional one. And we sent this letter. We made some noise around all the media to pass the legislation in the end.
And this was right around the same, this letter, this coalition you put together, this was right around this was basically the same time as the FTX collapse in early November, right?
Yeah.
And so I guess the timing couldn't have been better from that vantage point, at least. Karin, why don't you talk a bit about how, it seemed like there's just a flurry of activity in those weeks there, where you had Expedito Neto actually unexpectedly lost his re-election bid. So that seemed like it was sort of another death knell for this legislation when that happened. And then you guys were working behind the scenes to put together this letter, and then obviously the FTX debacle happens, and that whole thing unravels. And then now you're in this position where you've got this coalition of different non-crypto industry sectors that are saying, hey, we need to pass this. But then you also have the news reports of the media saying, like, look, like if we don't do this, like this is what's going to happen. Talk a bit about how did all the momentum kind of propel forward from all those events?
Sure. And let me get a charger while I do that. So look, elections are always a disruptor factor for Congress continuity of activities. And when there is the non-re-election of a rapporteur, there are 2 different paths that we can follow. There are those who actually don't go back to Brasilia. And there are those who actually understand their mission of approving something, which I think was the case of Expedito Neto. He understood that this would be his legacy. So even though elections impacted activities, he actually came back and approved the bill after not getting reelected, because he understood, and we talked a lot with him, me and Julian, about that. He understood that that would be his legacy. He's actually now the guy who approved the crypto first regulatory ecosystem in Latin America, not just in Brazil, one of the first in the world. So it's something that he needs to be really proud of. And he understood that it would be important for his political career as well to play that role as the father of the crypto bill, as he actually mentioned a few times for us. The letter came a little bit before the FTX collapse. No one knew the FTX collapse was going to happen. We were actually at the same day in the same event debating regulation, me and Julian. We were the only two people on stage stating that it was going to be approved when we released the letter, and then FTX came. And of course, cryptocurrencies companies, investors and government authorities, they were all processing and analyzing what happened with FTX, which impacted the entire sector. And here at BITO, we are sure that that situation actually represented an opportunity. It represented a great opportunity for us to place the core important things that needed to be placed in the market and analyze parameters of trust, of transparency, of risk management through the entire industry. And that also helped us to speed up the process of the bill. When we emerged in 2014, there was no regulatory clarity at all. We seek for licenses, as I already mentioned here, and not having clarity, not having transparency for users, for investors, and so on and so forth, it's something that needed to be changed. And FTX helped us understand that change was needed and that change was urgent. So summing up, even though elections had an impact, if you sum up the letter, the FTX collapse, and Expedito Neto seeing that as his legacy, I guess we have a combo of things that created a good ecosystem, not by hazard, let me say. FTX was by hazard, but not the letter and not Expedito that was built throughout policy plans and policy activities. But we had a sum of factors that actually got an interesting momentum for us to vote and approve the balanced law that we did.
Yeah, it was really... Sorry, go ahead, Julian. Any color you want to add there?
Very fast. My sensation here is, I'm sure that Karin will agree, we just served the sensitiveness and emotional momentum for Expedito Neto and for the whole market. It was very complicated with sensitive moment for the market because of FTX. And in the case of Expedito Neto, of course, was a very strong, sensitive moment for him in terms of elections and how he lose the contender.
Got it. And it definitely felt like a perfect storm type of moment, right, where you had all these factors colliding, and this sort of had to happen in this window, at least by the end of 2022, because if not, then who knows what's going to happen in the next Congress, especially with Expedito Neto not being reelected. So really getting that over the finish line before the end of the year was a huge win. Quickly, and I wanted to ask quick about, how would you respond to some of the, there's been some criticisms from others in the industry that locally in Brazil that this legislation, it doesn't take into account sort of the interests of startups or of people who are interested, or of the peer-to-peer segment of crypto, and that it's only looking after the interest of the big exchanges. And I think this is sort of a loaded question, just in the sense that anytime there's regulation of any sort, there's always inherently some sort of kicking away the ladder type of impact that is felt. But I guess what would your response be to critics in the industry who might level these charges, saying that this bill is sort of not really representative of the entire industry as a whole in Brazil.
Well, yes, it's in some ways it's kind of a philosophical way to think now or to discuss. We've been debating in all forums, seminars, and conferences, and I like to say we need to put some color on the regulation now, and not to lose the opportunity to continue to having this freedom of access, democracy of access, possibilities and alternatives of financial solutions, and to use this technology for other traditional markets in Brazil. We need to foresee what could be the possibilities using the blockchain and the DLTs. So when the people from the old blockchain thinking started to say, if you put regulation, you will kill the blockchain. I disagree. If you put some regulation now, you will be able to protect the system, protect the technology, to continue to provide the decentralizing solutions for everyone. That's it. We need to put now, or we will lose.
Karen, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I see the bill and the law as the tip of the iceberg. There's still much to be debated, and the process is like a fairly long secondary regulation process to come. We still have a lot to debate in the end, and I see that we gave a really interesting first step. I mean, providing general guidelines on important things like transparency, KYC, and so on and so forth. So now we get to a place where we actually have more granular information about specific points that we need to actually go deeper. The law, the way it is written now, will only have actual impact once we start to debate secondary regulation. And let's be honest, we are never going to have a perfect law. I mean, we're always going to point out something that it's not there and should be, or an incorrect taxonomy of something, or we'll criticize an article. And that's part of having 513 House of Representatives and 81 Senate debating something. You have so many different hats. In the end, you're going to have a piece of each one of them in a law that it's going to be approved. So it's not going to be perfect. It is not perfect, but it's a good first step. What we got to do now is actually guarantee that secondary regulation process will be open and ample enough for everybody to be able to participate. And I'm sure that the central bank, being the regulator, is actually going to do that through public consultations, through debates, consulting associations, and so on and so forth. So this way we can have the mindset of all that are going to be impacted to this regulation actually being taken into consideration when further developing the rules.
Let's talk a bit more about this theme of what comes next, right? Because really, passing the legislation is really just sort of, it's one battle in a war, right? It's like, it's a series of multiple battles. This is one battle that you won. Now the next battle is more of this kind of the technical secondary regulation, the establishing of licensing, establishing the rules and the regime, and how all these processes work. I know there's been some concern voiced by folks in the industry that it's been 2 months now since the legislation was passed. The executive branch still has not formally nominated the central bank as the regulator here, even though people expect it will happen, but it hasn't officially happened. And until it officially happens, no work can really be done on actually creating this licensing structure that the bill mandates. And it doesn't appear to be the case that the Lula administration is sees this as a very like high priority at the moment. And also there's been political unrest and a bunch of other things happening that have kind of, been distractions, I guess, as far as what we're talking about here. And, I think I just wanted to get your sense on like what needs to happen in the next 6 months or so to really like implement these rules and get these things kind of hashed out. And what are the kind of the main blockers at this point as far as getting these up and running? And I mean, will it be possible that we have a licensed crypto or a licensing framework in place by the end of the year here, by the end of 2023? Julian, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I can start, and Karin can complete some of the thoughts. Yeah, I think the next step, the first one and the priority one, the number 0 of priority is the decree indicating the regulator. We still don't have this decree, and we are working, starting some dialogues with the government and the chief of staff of presidency, asking them, where is the decree? Because we just have in front of us 5 months until the law being enacted. So the first one is this one. The second one, I think it's of course, I think the central bank is already working with a framework of regulation, specifically for licensing and non-authorization for all the exchange in Brazil who wants to work with it. The characteristics of this regulation, I'm not sure what are they going to enact, but I think on public consultations we will have some clarifications here, and it's how and why the industry association needs to be very close to the government, to put some color, to put some clarifications how we work, how the whole industry works in terms of business, and to put some suggestions for these public consultations for maybe specific licensing for the whole players that wants to work with it. We already know that the central bank established a tokenization group, internal tokenization group, to understand the whole picture of banking products that it's able to be tokenized, and all the solutions around banking to use this technology. That's a group that we should stay very close to them. And of course, we have the CVM, or Securities Exchange Committee, that is already evaluating and studying the whole securities that it's possible to tokenize also.
And there is, in addition to that, there's the open call for papers of the central bank as well, that also will actually foster the debate internally. I guess the progress, Aaron, is not always clear for everyone, especially in the case of the central bank, because they're technically super hermetic. So their technical groups are already working on secondary regulation, which is not open to the general public to understand in technical terms what they are producing in terms of material, of content, of resolutions, of secondary regulation, and so on and so forth. But it's clear for us that they are already working through working groups, through open calls of papers, and technically also internally. So when the moment comes, when we have the decree signed establishing hopefully them as the regulator, and when we start to debate it via public consultation together with associations and so on and so forth, they can already present something so society can actually start to collaborate. So there is progress. It's not always on surface, but what I think it's important for us to understand is that things are not stopped because the decree wasn't signed. Things are moving, but we do need the decree to be signed for actually trigger the process, which does not mean that we as public entities working and debating, we as associations, we as society are not debating how secondary regulation is going to be actually in fact.
Got it. And I think one of the big things that was not ultimately passed as part of this legislation into the law was this asset segregation provision. This was obviously the source of a lot of controversy and a lot of a lot of back and forth. And I think now the expectation is that, okay, the central bank is going to try to include this as part of their rulemaking, as part of their licensing structure. And they've said so publicly that they will try to include this. But I think I've also seen some other critiques saying that the legality of this isn't necessarily, cut and dry, I guess, which opens the door up for potential like lawsuits and litigation and other types of things like that to essentially throw sand in the gears. How long of a process do we have here on this more technical rulemaking front here? Are you expecting there to be sort of like a lawfare battle here between the various players involved, or is the central bank sort of? I mean, do we have confidence that, okay, these guys know what they're doing and they're going to, they've got a general idea what they're doing and they've got the path forward. They've done this before. They're the experts. We'll let them handle it. Or are you expecting this to be a pretty drawn out battle similar to the legislative effort from last year? Karen, you want to take that?
On asset segregation specifically, there's legal uncertainty on if the central bank can or cannot move forward through secondary regulation because there's no provision on the law. And when there's no provision on the law, there is a legal doubt on if they could or could not evolve via secondary regulation. What can happen to solve that issue faster, and me and Julian were actually discussing that a few months ago because we both wanted asset segregation to be approved in the law. In the case of BITSO, we do segregate assets of our clients, so that's an important rule in our mind to be in the regulatory framework for any crypto regulation around the world. So not having that passed in the law, there is one way for us to try to solve that fast, which is via medida provisoria, which is similar to an executive order in the US. And the central bank can work on that together with the Ministry of Finance and present it to Congress. And it needs to be evaluated by Congress in 90 days. And it has immediate effect. So if we have a medida provisoria or an executive order like type of regulation proposing that, it will be a way for us to solve the non-provision on the law issue and provide the ability for the central bank to evolve. One thing that Julian mentioned, and I think it's very important, he mentioned to me, is that even though it wasn't approved, the debate was actually fostered. And the debate, it's now, it started, and it is clear for the ecosystem, and especially after FTX, that we do need to approve, or at least to start to debate how the structure of asset segregation is going to start in Brazil. So that's one point. To your second point on timing, I like to make a comparison with the Brazilian GDPR, our General Law on Privacy. So the Brazilian GDPR actually started, and it was approved in Congress in 2018. And we're still discussing via secondary regulation how this is going to be implemented for different pillars. So I don't see us finishing the process of secondary regulation up to the end of this year. I see it happening through 2, 3, 4, maybe more years ahead. And of course, things will change and evolve, and we will keep redebating and changing secondary regulation and improving and making it make more sense for the ecosystem, and depending on how technologies evolve, how users are going to use it, new uses, new projects, and so on and so forth. So I see this as a continuous process of improvement of secondary regulation that will happen through many, many, many years. Great.
Well, we're about out of time here. So I just want to throw one final question to the both of you, which was, so both of you have been, government affairs professionals your whole career, lobbying on behalf of a variety of industries, tech sectors, tech companies, as well as non-tech. Really wanted to ask about just how does this particular victory and getting this law passed sort of stack up against other experiences you've had at other points of your career working for other companies or other sectors? Is there? I mean, Karen, you mentioned earlier about how, in other industries you're generally advocating against regulation, and here you're advocating for regulation, which is a bit of a different approach. But is anything? How does this sort of stack up in your body of career work at this point? Julian, you want to take that first?
Yeah, sure. After 21 years working with public policy, and of course, I've been working with great challenges in my life. Technology, as I said to you, technology has the capacity of changing people's lives, and it's embarked with a lot of causes for society. I started to understood. I started to understand what building public policy is so important in terms of changing people's life and creating causes for society. I mean, the whole picture, not working with just monitoring the government or tackling the bad bills or draft that is not good for the industry. Not so that I started to think more proactively, to seeing the whole picture, to seeing the what people needs, and the whole process is based on building a very nice communication process through the society. It's not just dealing with policymakers at all. It's the way how to changing people's mind, to show them this is important for you. This will change your life in an economic way. It will provide you more access and more solutions for your life. So that's now it's bears in my mind the importance of building public policy. In terms of career, it's a great opportunity. I think working for technology, and specifically for blockchain technology, it's been so nice.
Sounds like you got red pilled, huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Hey, that's what we're all about here in crypto land, right? So once you get red pilled, you can't go back. Karen, what about you?
I mean, couldn't agree more. And I guess approving a law and perceiving that you were part of that process through building the narrative towards something that you really believe in. It's actually a key milestone for the career of any public policy professional. And it is not different in that case. I mean, you feel that you're part of a process of approving something that it's actually good and balanced. And I mean, I feel very proud of being able to participate of that process. I also feel very proud to be able to work for a company that believes that regulation is good, that actually already is regulated end to end, and wants to build and debate regulation towards the ecosystem with regulators all over the world. But I guess most important thing, and Julian touched upon that a little bit, is what is the impact that regulation will have in people's lives? I mean, in the end, we're actually providing a way for people to move their money fast in a more transparent manner, in a more secured manner. And approving that law will actually help them to do that in a more secure way. So we're providing security, transparency to users via regulation, and that's actually priceless.
Great. Well, thanks so much to both of you for coming on, and it's been really great having you both here and sharing your stories, sharing a bit of some of the behind the scenes of how you're able to pass this bill last year, and how you're working to bring crypto into the mainstream here in Brazil here through the regulatory process. So really appreciate both of your time, and why don't you just give a quick shout out to how can folks find you or learn more about you and or personally or the companies that you work for. Karen, you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, you can all find me on LinkedIn, Karen Duque, and you can look into Bito at LinkedIn, but also our blog, which is actually super interesting. We have updates all the time on important subject matters for the market. I'll share it with you, Aaron, the address so you can actually have in the post, and folks can actually look into that. You can also, I mean, download the app and follow us on social media. There's always interesting content there on our side, on influencer side, and so on and so forth. I guess that's the best way to follow the news regarding the ecosystem and regarding what Bito is doing.
And then Julian, how can folks find you and follow what MB is doing?
Yeah, the same as Karen. We have a lot of content on LinkedIn. We've been working so hard on that. We have Reinaldo, Roberto publishing a lot of news and business model that we've been working on it. So we can find on Julian Dutra or Roberto Dagnoni or Reinaldo Rabelo. There are a lot of content, very, very nice content about, especially for tokenization, or next step for blockchain industry.
Perfect. Well, thanks again, both. And thanks to everybody for listening. And we will see you next time.